Welcome to GroundTalk, the GroundTalk podcast. And in the first in a series of Australia special episodes, we're going to be speaking to experts in their field on environmental risks and how they're perceived in the property industry. We're diving today into the realities of buying a property in a 1% flood risk zone. So what that really means, what the risks are involved, and the key factors buyers need to consider before making an investment in one of these areas. And this all came about because we came across a Reddit thread titled, "Would you buy a property on the border of a 1% flood zone?" And there seemed to be a lack of understanding from the general public about what this means and the ramifications of doing so. We hope this session can bring some clarity to that question and also just give you some insight on exactly what the risks are and what needs to be done against them. Now, I'm really pleased to say that today joining me is Hala Hubraq. Hala is an expert in environmental and disaster risk, and Hala leads the practice at Polenta, a firm that specialises in creating impactful climate adaptation and resilience programmes. She has been leading policy and action in this space for over 15 years across multiple independent government and non-government agencies in Australia and beyond. She has recently been involved in leading the development of the New South Wales State Disaster Mitigation Plan. So welcome, Hala. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
So by the end of this episode, we hope you'll walk away with a clear understanding of what it means to buy in a 1% flood risk zone, expert-backed strategies to assess and manage risks, and also real-world insights to make a more informed property decision. So whether you're a home buyer, an investor, you're just curious about environmental risks, or you'd like a bit more of an understanding just to better advise your clients, then this episode of GroundTalk will help. So to get us started, and obviously in line with what the whole podcast is about, we quite often see that flood maps and reports state that there's a 1% or a 1 in 100 year flood risk in certain areas. Hala, can you just help us explain exactly what that means to potential property buyers?
Yeah, so what those percentages are trying to describe is the risk of a flood of a particular size reaching that property. And this size, the 1%, is often the size that councils or governments manage in terms of their planning. And that's why it may make its way in terms of like property certificates, etc. So the way we describe floods is based on a percentage of or a chance of that flood occurring in any 1 year. So the more likely the flood, the larger the percentage or chance, and the smaller its size actually, and the less likely or the smaller the percentage or chance, the larger its actual size. So the percentage describes the chance of a flood reaching a particular level above the river that flood relates to at any 1 year, and covering the floodplain and the low-lying areas at that level. So a 1% or 1 in 100 has a 1% chance of occurring in any 1 year. So, for example, in the Hawkesbury River, in an area in Western Sydney, a 1% flood event would reach 17 metres above the kind of normal river level. And it's different depending on what river and what floodplain you're at. So that means a house built at a 1% level at Windsor in that surrounding area, when the river goes up to 17 metres, it would reach their floor level, which is what's being denoted at the on that certificate. A more likely flood, say like a 1 in 20, which has a 5% chance of occurring in any 1 year, is actually smaller than a 1 in 100. And so that would, for example, reach at that same spot that I've been talking about by example, would reach about 14 metres above the river level. And so this would be, I guess it wouldn't reach that house, but it's still quite a significant flood and more likely. A less likely flood, say for example, a 1 in 500 has a 0.2 chance of happening in any 1 year, and it would be larger. So that sort of flood at that same spot that I've spoken about would reach 20 metres above the river. And what that means is that if there was a house built at that 1%, it would be 3 metres above that. So potentially at its roof, if it's a 1-storey house or just above its roof level. And so that could be quite a significant flood impact at that home. So it's also, I mean, these percentages, it's really hard, but it's important to note that they occur randomly. So a 1% chance in 1 year doesn't mean that if it occurs that year, it won't occur the following year. There's a chance every year. There's a 1% chance every year, or a 5% chance every year. So it could occur several years in a row. And in fact, what tends to happen is actually we have wet periods and dry periods. So lots of floods happen in, say, a period of a few decades, and then we tend to have really long dry periods, which is when people think, we're fine here, but actually it's just the cyclical nature of weather events. And so, actually a person living to the age of 70, for example, has a 50% chance of experiencing a 1% or 1 in 100 in their lifetime, and they have a 10% chance of actually experiencing it twice. So it's really hard, and always with percentages and kind of probabilities, we're not great with that as humans. But the reality is they seem small, but realistically speaking, when you're talking about something like an asset or a property that's going to be there for a long period of time, it may well be that those things do occur. And it's important to note as well that this information is based on modeling. So, people look at, scientists look at the geography of an area, and they look at how bad the rainfall could get, and it's really based on lots of different information. And our understanding of that can also improve over time, and so these numbers can be revised. So if you see 1%, it means that if there's a 1% chance any 1 year that a flood would reach the floor level of that property. And if the property is kind of adjacent to that line, it's probably going to have a similar risk unless it's very much higher than that level. And the other thing to just keep in mind as well is it is really about that differential. So the 1% chance, yes, reaches the floor level, but how much higher could it go? In some parts of Australia, like the space I've been speaking about in Western Sydney, it can go so much higher, and that they call it the probable maximum flood, or the largest possible flood. In some parts of the Hawkesbury kind of floodplain in Western Sydney, it can go 9 or 10 meters above the 1 in 100 level. So that would be above a 2-story house even. And that what we're talking about there is really not just a risk to that property, that potential property being damaged, but also a risk to your life if you were to stay there and not leave, because there's really nowhere to go. And we've seen that in some instances in other parts of the state, other parts of Australia. And so really the thing to understand in addition to that number is how much higher could it go? And then can you evacuate safely? What's the access to that property like? Will you have enough notice? And this information is something you can get from the local council or the state emergency service, because they would be planning for that. And related to that would be information on how fast the water can go. So in some floodplains, it's quite slow, and that gives you time. But in some parts of floodplains, like depending on where that property is situated, it's not only reaching that, the water's not only reaching that property, but it's also going very, very fast, which could pose a greater risk to the property itself and of course yourself if you're there. And that's also sometimes that information in terms of velocity has also been modelled depending on the information source that you've got. So I know access to this information is difficult and it's kind of confusing, and hopefully over time it will become easier. But at this point, there's information sources from private providers, councils, the state emergency service that I mentioned. Insurance companies also will have a sense. So based on the quote that you get, they will have factored in all the risk at all levels, not just the 1%. And so that's also helpful information to get when you want to understand what the exposure is to that property.
And ourselves, of course, as well.
Yes.
So just to think, so the 1% or the 1 in 100 year, it's as much about the severity of that flood as it is actually about the probability.
Correct. Yeah. So there's that's right. And the severity of floods, other floods possible at that property. I mean, these percentages are just being used to describe various levels of risk. And like I said, what has occurred in New South Wales is, and actually overseas in the States, is the 1% has been focused on as kind of like the risk to manage too, but that hasn't factored in all the other things that I've mentioned, which is access, how much worse could it get? So, there are some other places in the world where the worst possible flood above a 1 in 100 is a meter further. And that's a very different ball game to 9 meters, right? And it's also a very different ball game when you do have good access and egress and the roads don't dip back into the floodplain before you go out. Maybe they're going up, and so you're going up a hill. That's a different prospect to a home that's still at the 1 in 100, but is somewhere where you'd actually have to go down to leave.
Okay.
And so I guess that sort of the layers of complexity in terms of probability is really hard to kind of fully comprehend. And what people want to do is kind of put one standard. It's like, if we manage to that level, we're done. But unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. It requires a little bit more thought.
Okay. Because you mentioned as well, having different periods of weather. So we'll have a certain period of wet weather and then a certain drought. And isn't that kind of what happened over in California when we saw the LA wildfires? They're quite well known for having a dry state, but they had a few years of wet weather, which obviously let the vegetation grow. And then that dry period comes in and the bushfire season comes in, and there's a hell of a lot more to burn. So.
Yeah, and there's other factors again in terms of where people and how people have built in proximity to that risk over time. Again, during like the wet periods or the dry periods when nothing was occurring, we can get a false sense of security that everything's okay, though many people in California knew that this was something that could always come back. But I think that the distinction there again is, as you said, some of our wetter periods are now more wet. Then there's also how we've amended the landscape. So in California, I know the types of trees they've been building, eucalyptus trees and things like that, which are much more flammable. And so there's always a range of factors that come in, and probably elements of climate change already being felt. I know that the winds and the kind of the duration that those winds were lasting for, and the kind of setting up those conditions, more extreme. And so it's all the factors of, there's more of us, we're in higher risk places, and we're doing things to the landscape that might make it more risky. And then we've got the weather changes happening as well.
If this is actually shown in the property matters of a contract of sale, what advice or next steps would you give to the buyer in terms of, what do they need to look at? What do they need to consider if it's actually shown in there?
Yeah, so like I said, considering the location of the property. So is it that risk from a river? Is it from localized flooding? How much higher could it go? So how much worse could it get? And are there any other risks too? And also thinking about that bit about being able to evacuate. And then the things to think about there is, there's the risk of the property being damaged. So what you need to think about there is the insurance. So looking at insurance quotes or speaking to an insurance company will give you a really good sense of how they look at that risk. They won't look at just one number, the 1%, they'll look at everything, because they're going to look at all the probabilities of what could occur at your property. And then the other thing to think about is evacuation risk. And in New South Wales, which is the state where we are, the State Emergency Services is responsible for managing evacuations, etc. And your local branch would have good information about your property.
Okay. Yeah. So
considering,
yeah, because I was going to say, so for anybody that doesn't know, where are the best places to actually get these sources of information? Yeah,
great. And so local council, they will have some, generally do have updated information about the flood risk in that space, in that spot. The other place to go is the State Emergency Service in that area. They will also have information, and then the insurance companies may not tell you the exact risk that they've calculated, but they will give you a quote, and that will tell you what they think the risk is from their perspective.
Okay, that's great. So
there
obviously,
are also private providers as well that also provide information, and they're all good to look at. Really, the more that you can look at, the better it will be for you. It's a big investment generally, potentially your entire life savings. So it's really important to look into all the possibilities.
yeah, because we always find it's obviously, we at GroundTalk, we've come from the UK, and actually having a look into these sorts of things is very much mandated from a solicitor point of view of what they should be looking at in terms of flood risk and things like contaminated land and pieces like that. It can be quite daunting for somebody who's buying a property who doesn't actually understand that these risks are involved and where they should get that information. So that it's something that we try to do is try to give them as much information as we can. But also, given obviously you've got quite vast experience working with government and non-government groups across Australia and beyond, what do you think needs to be done at a state level to actually negate flood risk? And we said we'd mention it, but also if we take the future risk from climate change into account as well.
Yeah, well, as you said, it's a lot for an individual to consider all of this. And when a property is already located in a position and you're considering buying it, often many decisions have already been made about where it's located, what sort of roads are available or other evacuation options, and a lot of that is governmental planning. So the role really of states and others at the government level is to consider those the impact of those decisions on the risk down to the individual property buyer, who will often not have much ability to change what risk is that property is exposed to. Of course, you can do certain things, so you can put in bushfire resistant material, flood resistant material, but really it's the location, and that's planning, infrastructure planning, and really coordinating that well across governments and working with local communities to think about those risks and what's possible and what makes sense for each place.
Yeah, because obviously it's one of those things. We know there's certain areas. You mentioned like Hawkesbury and the Northern Rivers area, which have seen quite a few flood instances in the past, which have been quite devastating. But do you see it actually spreading to different areas as well? Is it these certain areas have that that chemistry of exactly where that flood's going to happen with the rivers that are there and things will happen? Or is this something that's going to increase the more we see a higher intensity of rainfall, bigger storms and things like that across the state and across the country as well?
Yeah, certainly climate change modelling, the recent modelling does show that there will be increases in certain areas and decreases in other areas in terms of the risk. However, how we feel these events, these flood events, is really in shocks. So when we talk about climate change impacts, they're incremental. Generally, they're incrementally increasing the risk. But what that really means is that you'll feel it all at once when something occurs, and it is increasing the depth, the potential, and the probability of those occurring in many places across the state. And we know where those risky areas are. Yeah, as you said, generally they are near the river floodplains that we know. And historically, we have developed on river floodplains because they're fertile land, and it's also very nice when it's not flooding. And so there is a lot of historical development in those areas. And they are quite well known across the state and across Australia. And I guess that legacy issue is something that we have to contend with. But then beyond that, it's also, as we know, we need further development with further housing to address affordability and other concerns. And so it's where do we put that new development in the context of climate change risks, increasing risks, other risks too. So it is really complex, but there are solutions, and thinking about it strategically up front is the best way to do it before we make that an issue for the individual property buyer.
Okay. So we mentioned state level there. What more do you think needs to be done at a national level, and even moving beyond that from at an international level as well?
Yeah, so I think it's the scale. So we've had significant events in the past few years, and we know where the risk is in other places, and then there's other disaster risks as well, other than flooding. And we know that's all going to increase generally with climate change, and as population grows, more people are exposed. So the scale of the impact, particularly from an economic damage perspective, is really something we need to think about nationally and internationally. Because the scale of what will be required to recover is going to increase, and that will be putting greater pressure on national budgets, international budgets, and potentially even reinsurance pools. So collectively, we all know that that's coming, but the more proactive planning that we do, the better position that we will be in for the individuals, and also as governments will be in better positions as well.
So do you, obviously in the roles that you've had previously and in your role now, are you still coming up against people who are quite skeptical about the climate crisis and what's happening and what's going to happen in the future? Because I always find it quite fascinating that people are still sticking their head in the sand around exactly what's going on in the world, around the climate risks anyway.
Yeah, I think it varies, of course. It's definitely decreased in the past few years, particularly in Australia, actually around the world, because of the climate events that have been occurring.
Okay.
But I think what tends to happen is that when it comes to making some difficult choices, either for an individual in government or an individual at a property level with their property, to reduce the risk, which may mean moving away, may mean making significant investment in how to do things differently, there is still sometimes reticence to deal with that because it's something that hasn't occurred yet. So we're very good at dealing with things that have occurred, and we are, but then it's this pre-planning for things that might occur and we don't know when. That's more difficult because you're talking about investing something that is meaningful to you right now for something to avoid something that might happen in the future. And generally, as humans, we're not very good at that sort of forward planning, and it is really hard to kind of to get there. But really the way to do that is to think it's not just about avoiding risk. There are also opportunities in working in this way and thinking differently about what we want our communities and developments to look like, because ultimately what we all want is effectively well-being, safe communities, and that means that we have to plan differently for many reasons, not just climate risks, based on what we've already got today. So I guess that future requires this new way, a new investment, new ways of thinking. And that's a lot of that is opportunity and not just risk avoidance.
Yeah, and I suppose as well from a political standpoint, it's quite difficult to actually get the public backing for trying to fund something that might happen in the future or is predicted to happen in the future as well. Obviously, they're spending the people's funds, so actually having to be able to politically get away with that or actually get it into practice is quite difficult for them to do.
Yeah, and the reason that is because it's felt right now. But I think because we have been feeling the effects and the costs of recovering from these events, and that's true, that is also a significant taxpayer recovery funds that ends up occurring, that has been felt. So I think that impetus to spend ahead to reduce that bill over time is there, but it's still very difficult. So what we need to think about is the benefits that we would get right now from making those investments that are not just about avoiding that risk, but also the types of lives that we would live in the interim. So it's really making those choices more attractive and looking at the other benefits. So, for example, if we're building more resistant highways or roads that enable people to evacuate, perhaps they can also then be freight routes or there's other benefits, so we call them co-benefits to these investments, and they can be quite significant. So it's really focusing on the positives that come regardless, and that come in addition to the risk avoidance. The other thing, which is basically what we've been talking about here, is really clear about what the risk means and then the benefits of when it occurs and we've avoided the risk. So to simplify that is that when something doesn't happen, we often don't know, right? We know when a flood has occurred, but there has been a lot of investments in avoiding risk, which has meant that we haven't seen significant damage from, say, massive storm events, etc., because there has been planning. And so really communicating that benefit is really important at that time. Like, yes, this is what occurred now. We've had, say, minimal damage, but this is what could have occurred if we hadn't made this investment. And, having a bank of that type of information of the avoided costs and really communicating that often is something that's really important, because it shows that benefit over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that local councils also have their part to play? Because we've seen that the responsibility of mapping flood zones being passed to them, each individual council. But do you think that's been working effectively, or do you think there's anything else that can be done there?
Yeah, so in our state, so in New South Wales, generally the mapping and management of flood risk is at the council level with support from state government. The scale of so mapping consistently is what there's a kind of policy that's set up at a state level to enable councils to map consistently, and it's reviewed at the state level. That's all fine. What the complexity that has occurred though is that the consequences of understanding that flood risk and then what that means in terms of responding to that flood risk are quite significant, and in some instances beyond the scale of a single council. So where there are hundreds of homes potentially affected or at risk, the response is beyond the scale of that council. And so it needs the levels of government to coordinate between themselves to really think well or strategically about what can or cannot be achieved. So I think more should be done in terms of partnerships at different government levels, and that is definitely the direction the state is going in, because of the need to think across council borders and at the scale that is going to be required, and in fact nationally, because the scale is going to be beyond over time, beyond what even a single state can deal with on its own.
Yeah, because I think I totally agree with what you're saying. Actually having a uniformity for everybody using the same methods of mapping and the data that they use, because you can see it. Obviously we speak to a lot of conveyancers and solicitors, and them having to deal with a transaction in one council and then dealing with another transaction in a different council. The data that they're getting from that planning certificate can be, well, just interpreted in a completely different way. So yeah, like you say, them being able to talk to each other and actually come up and work together would be really beneficial.
And exactly, and I think really also at the kind of that state level, what needs to occur, and even national level, is a consistent level of information for all places in the state. It's already hard enough to kind of get your head across this kind of level of information without it being consistent and also accessible. It has been difficult in the past to do that because of the perceived impact on property values of releasing that information. But the benefits far outweigh in terms of the transparency of everybody being able to know what and is or isn't at risk, and also in a consistent fashion to enable planning. That I know that is an action that has been taken at the state level. It will take some time, but it's something that is very, very important, because we all need to be starting from the same starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. Because obviously we have the planning certificate, the 10.7 council certificate. Do you think that goes far enough to inform and warn about potential flood risks? And what else can future homeowners do to actually look into that?
Yeah, so the 10 points of in-council certificate looks at effectively any controls or other issues with that land, and that tends to relate to whether there's any flood-related controls that council has placed, which generally relate to the 1%, so the 1 in 100 chance map that they've mapped themselves. And as we've been discussing, that sometimes does not consider the full extent of the risk. So it could be in that area, you could have a further 7, 8, 9 meters of flooding in the worst possible event. It doesn't also consider if it's a safely evacuable kind of place. So can you get out of there? It's not just about the property damage. So there's a range of other information that is needed to fully gauge what that means. So I would say it doesn't go far enough, but its purpose is to kind of say this is what the council has done in terms of these related planning controls. It's not sufficient to get that full kind of climate risk information. It's actually probably another tool that's required to do that. It's not. This is the kind of the blunt instrument of there are controls here, but it's really what else is there? What other information do I need to know about the risk here?
Okay. Because we've touched on, or you touched on, or mentioned, different other kinds of risks that affect Australia and certain states. But what is distinct about the issue of managing flood risk as opposed to other disaster risks such as storms or heat or bushfires?
Yeah, I think the understanding of the probabilities that we've discussed is definitely distinct, although those events can also be kind of understood in that way. So how likely is it I get a heat event of this magnitude? But the response, I think, is what distinguishes it. The location of the property really determines a lot of the risk in a way that you can't really mitigate. So with heat, we can build differently. We can put in air conditioning, etc., to manage that heat risk more effectively than you could, I would say, with flood-related sort of building materials and that sort of things, which could reduce the risk, but effectively, it's still that risk to life is always potentially going to be there, which you cannot really reduce, and also. Those building materials can be quite expensive upfront, etc., and it is much more extensive what needs to be done to reap the benefits of those modifications. So it's really that the fact that the response requires not just the individual decision maker, it's really a whole of government and other decision makers to make sure that properties are situated in places that are where the flood risk can be managed.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So obviously, we've also talked about, there's a predicted increase in the severity of things like storms, of rainfall and extreme heat in Australia. How do you see the home buying process being affected? You mentioned earlier that you were speaking to an insurer recently. So in terms of insurance and lending specifically, because that's something that we hear about a lot, how do you see that having an effect on those two things?
Yeah, so I think the home buying process will be affected because the kind of the knowledge of these risks is increasing and the awareness is increasing. Banks and also insurers are generally well aware of what the risks are to properties and potentially their future risks and where they're increasing. However, I guess in the real estate industry at the moment, that risk is not necessarily something that needs to be disclosed in a completely open fashion. Whilst the bank may know and the insurer may know, there's not a lot of action that's yet been taken. And insurers generally price risk for the next few years. So while they may know that future risk is coming, they may that premium that you get may not be determinative of what might occur in the future. And so I guess whilst there is knowledge within that system, that it's not actually transferring into how property buying is occurring at the moment. So I think at the moment, it's kind of, there's a transfer of risk going on, where some property owners and other people who know are potentially selling out of higher risk areas, and some people who are maybe buying in, maybe because it's cheaper, maybe for other reasons, may not actually be aware. And I would say at the moment, the system and how it's kind of set up doesn't have a catch-all for those people, to really inform them of what they are buying into. And this is this is kind of a lot of the historical development where these, we've developed near coasts, near rivers, for a long period of time. So there are many properties like this.
Yeah, and it's scary as well. We hear about premiums of $20,000-$30,000. And then speaking to quite a few people, you'll hear about them being quoted these vast sums, and that need for actually wanting to get on the property ladder or buy that property in a certain area. We'll see them get the quote so that they can actually get their mortgage, and then cancel the insurance quote just so that they can actually move in, and then move in without the insurance. And as you say, insurers, they're not daft when it comes to what sort of premiums they put on a site. They know what the risks are, and that's why they put it so high. So you're running that risk of that property getting flooded without any insurance, and then having to foot the bill, which is scary.
Yeah, and I think that's why there is really an impetus and onus on tackling this issue, and the full extent of it, particularly for that historical development, and not putting more development in those areas where that sort of outcome could occur again. Ultimately, it's going to be the government's issue and then the taxpayers' issue where that occurs. So it's really in all our interests to think differently from now, and plan differently from now.
Yeah, and I think going back to that you mentioned earlier, obviously there was a hell of a lot of bailouts with the last one, with people being underinsured and things like that. And that planning process that you've mentioned, surely that's part of the thinking, in that they don't want to have to fund bailouts in the future.
Yeah, well, I mean, the scale of the scale of the sort of buyback, so buying properties back from owners where they've been damaged or severely kind of affected by a flood, the scale of the properties that could be affected today in our state and across the state is kind of in the order of billions of dollars. And the reality is that taxpayer funds will run out over time to kind of completely buy people out. And so what are the decisions that we are making before all those events occur to plan for that, and also, I guess, limit the exposure of new developments too, because there are still plenty of developments going on in those areas, and that is kind of the crux of this difficult situation, of recognizing that we already have a lot of development that is exposed, really highly exposed. What's going to occur where, yes, even if they do have insurance or they don't have insurance, how are those people going to recover? Where are they going to go? And how do we plan for that? And then in terms of more development where we do need it, to house people, particularly people where they can, to increase affordability effectively for the people who are buying in these higher risk areas, because that's all they can afford. The pendulum is also on making it possible for them to buy in lower risk areas too. And then all of that actually requires us thinking about, how do we all want to live? It's kind of fundamental. What are we willing to accept in terms of lifestyle, so that, and then how that goes with that risk? Because generally a lot of people buy in coastal zones or on rivers because of the lifestyle, but also factors sometimes in terms of price. But ultimately, that probably may not be the most sustainable or kind of manageable in terms of risk way of living into the future. It's a completely reimagined, probably higher, medium sort of density living in places that are safer with more connectivity, etc. But then that whole planning issue it kind of all comes to a head together in one thing, which is, well, how do we live? How do we want to live? Where do we want to live? And how do we want to live together? And what does good look like in terms of those lifestyles? So really making cities more livable is actually a huge part of dealing with these risks on the ground, because the more attractive kind of urban-based, amenity-based like living that is at lower risk, the lower the risk that we will have over time in kind of like flood and coastal zones.
Yeah. Okay. That's that's really interesting to hear. And this, just to wrap up, this isn't necessarily a New South Wales or even an Australia related question, but do you think climate change is being taken seriously enough?
I guess similarly to what we were saying previously, I think it is being taken more seriously because we have had significant events in the recent periods of time. So the California fires, previously lots of cyclones in the States, and the flood events here, fires, etc., in Europe, and other events. So I think there's kind of climate extremes, and the fact that they are becoming more frequent is definitely getting people's attention. However, kind of our ability to deal with those shock events that may occur and then not reoccur for a period of time as humans is limited, because it means that we have to do something difficult today to avoid something occurring in the future. So that kind of the adaptation side of climate change, which requires that sort of foresight thinking, the pre-planning thinking, I think is still catching up with the work around reducing emissions, because that seems to be more tangible to people. But unfortunately, it's all happening all at once, and we kind of need to crack on with all of it. So in that sense, I think it could, the adaptation side and what it means, so the scale of what it's going to mean, which is potentially mass movements of people, is not being taken seriously enough. But that is the reality that is coming, unfortunately. But the more that we plan from it, the more that we talk about it actually as communities and societies, the better prepared we'll be. It is not all terrible. There are, as I said, opportunities that come from reimagining how we want to live into the future, and kind of dealing with these things head on rather than pretending and hoping that they don't occur. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, until it happens to you, but actually happens on your doorstep, then it's hard to get people to actually take more notice of it, right?
Yeah, but I think we can do it, and we can link it to basically how people are engaging and living in a place today. So if we start having those conversations place by place, community by community, what are you dealing with today? What are the stresses that you're dealing with today? What are the issues that you're dealing with today? And you'll find that they're kind of all related. The economic stresses, the other kind of transport issues are going to be related to the risk issues in that place. And so if we bring that all together and think, okay, so into the future as we plan, how do we want to address all of these issues and reimagine how we live together? And there is going to be a lot of investment over long periods of time in all our communities, particularly in even in developing countries. We are building roads, we are building infrastructure, we are doing things. So there's an opportunity to do that, to amend those plans slightly, to make us more resilient and better prepared for what comes next. And that will have generally the benefit of making us a stronger society in the meantime. So it's not all bad, but really having and making the time and space for those conversations and that planning is tricky, but it's possible, and it's going to make us better overall.
Yeah, very good. Well, that is all for this special episode of GroundTalk. Hala, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us and sharing your insights. It's been really interesting, and I've learned quite a lot as well throughout the last 40 odd minutes. So yeah, thank you for that. We hope this episode gives you a clearer picture of what flood risk really means, how to assess it, and what steps to take when considering a property investment in a flood-prone area. And if you did find this episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others who might benefit from it. And if you have any questions or any topics you'd like us to cover, please let us know. We're always keen to tackle the conversations that matter most to you. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on GroundTalk. Thank you.